There are whispers that the sky above Terra once trembled. Not with thunder or storm, but with something older. A distortion in the firmament, where light recoiled and prayers turned to ash upon the tongue. For one impossible instant, the Emperor's light seemed to falter. Vox channels died in unison, astropaths screamed in chorus, and the shadows stretched too long across the marble of the Imperial Palace. They called it a distortion. They called it a test. But in the deep halls of the Adeptus Custodes, where silence itself feels sacred, a single word echoed through the golden corridor's gate. No mortal can fathom the horror of such a thing on Terra, the holiest of all worlds, the heart of mankind's dominion. Yet rumors persisted, of impossible shapes flickering in the air above the Himalayan peaks, of the warp bleeding through reality's skin, of a sound low and patient, like the breathing of something vast and waiting. If a chaos gate ever opened upon the throne world itself, no fortress, no legion, no god could ever truly save mankind. Only faith would remain, and even that, perhaps, would burn. And yet, deep beneath the sanctified catacombs, there are those who claim to have seen the signs. They swear it has already begun. If you walk the narrow path between truth and heresy, if you crave the stories the ecclesiarchy dares not record, then join us. Subscribe, stay close, and bear witness. For tonight, we descend into the forbidden heart of the Imperium and glimpse what should never be seen. There are moments on Terra when silence feels heavier than war. I used to think that was a poetic thing priests said, until the day I stood upon the marble causeway of the Sanctum Imperialis and felt that silence pressing down on my bones. The air itself seemed older here, sanctified by the blood of 10,000 generations. Every breath tasted of dust and incense, the twin perfumes of devotion and decay. Above us, the banners of the Imperium hung still in the thin, stale wind. The sigil of the Aquila stretched like a prayer against the pallid sky. My name no longer matters. To the administratum, I am just one among the countless honor guards stationed upon the throne world, a relic of the Astra Militarum reassigned to ceremonial duty. We stand motionless for hours beside the pilgrim paths that wind toward the palace. Sometimes days pass without a single word spoken. We are not permitted to look up toward the golden throne itself, only to face outward, toward the people, the pilgrims, the broken multitudes who crawl across Terra seeking even a shadow of his light. It was during one of those endless vigils that I first sensed the wrongness. It came not as sound or sight, but as a tremor in the air, a subtle vibration that thrummed through my armor and rattled the augmetic bones in my leg. I remember turning my head slightly, earning a reprimand through the vox from my sergeant. Hold position, but even he couldn't hide the uncertainty in his tone. Around us, the chanting of pilgrims faltered, and the great bell towers along the processional of the Sacred Heart ceased their rhythm all at once. For a single heartbeat, the Astronomican dimmed. Every sanctioned psyker on Terra screamed in unison, not in words, but in sheer psychic agony. The vox networks overloaded with static and blood. I saw a confessor collapse to his knees, clutching his rosarius as though it might anchor him to reality. The light across the horizon took on a strange, reddish hue, not the crimson of sunset but the color of raw flesh, the bleeding wound of a sky that had forgotten what it meant to be whole. Then the silence deepened, the kind that suffocates thought. Even the constant hum of the city's forges, the heartbeat of Terra itself, seemed to fade. In that stillness, I heard something impossible. A whisper, low and patient, threading through the vox like the echo of a forgotten name. When the light returned, it was fractured. The sky over the Himalayan range rippled as though viewed through water. Pilgrims began to cry out in awe and terror. I turned, breaking protocol, and saw it. A distortion hovering above the distant peaks, vast and silent. No thunder, no explosion. Just a seam of darkness splitting the heavens apart, spreading thin lines of red and violet light that pulsed like veins beneath skin. The vox filled with orders, overlapping, panicked. The Adeptus Arbites moved to contain the crowds. The ecclesiarchy chanted louder, their hymns rising in desperation as though volume could stave off damnation. But there was no denying what we saw. The wound in the sky widened, its edges shimmering with warp light. By the time the first storm reached us, the day had vanished. The wind came without warning, carrying the taste of iron and ozone. Vox lines went dead again. I could see the glow of plasma generators flickering, one by one, across the horizon. The city plunged into half-light, the only illumination coming from the faint auroras flickering around the rift. Above, something moved within it, not form, not shape, but suggestion. The impression of motion too vast to belong to any material creature. Around me, men fell to their knees. Some prayed, others screamed. One, a young guardsman barely old enough to bear a lasgun, began laughing hysterically until his voice broke into sobs. I tried to hold my weapon steady, though I knew there was nothing to shoot at. The sky itself was our enemy now. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time began to lose meaning. Then, through the haze of panic, a figure emerged from the direction of the palace. Golden armor gleamed in the half-darkness, polished to mirror brightness even beneath the blood-red glow. Custodian. The sight of him silenced even the hysterical. He moved with the solemn certainty of a god walking among mortals, his guardian spear resting against his shoulder. He did not speak. He didn't need to. His presence was command enough. We straightened, fell into line, and waited for orders that never came. He turned his gaze skyward, the mirrored lenses of his helm reflecting the wound above. I could have sworn I heard him whisper something then. Not a prayer, not a curse, but a word carried off by the wind. Gate. The sound froze me, because that word gate was forbidden. Not since the siege of Terra had anyone dared to speak it. The last time the warp had reached this world, the galaxy burned for 10,000 years. And now I was watching the beginning of it again. The custodian turned away and began to walk toward the palace gates, vox codes lighting across his vambrace. A golden transmission arc spread across the skyline, an emergency signal. Somewhere deep within the mountain, alarms were screaming. I could feel them through the stone underfoot. The Astronomican's beacon flickered again, dimmer this time as though struggling against interference. Someone shouted that the Mechanicus had sealed the forges. Another swore that the ecclesiarch himself was being escorted to the inner sanctum. Rumors spiraled faster than sense. The pilgrims began to scatter, trampling each other in blind panic. I wanted to help them, to reassert order, but my legs refused to move. My mind was locked on that impossible word still echoing in my head. Gate. The wind howled through the sacred avenues of Terra, carrying ashes and distant screams. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the warp shimmered like a living wound, its edges gnawing at reality. And for the first time in my service, for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel truly small. The Emperor's light still burned. But for how long? The next morning, if morning could even exist under such a wounded sky, dawn arrived as a gray shroud instead of light. The sun was gone, obscured behind the constant shimmer of the rift. It pulsed faintly, sending waves of distortion across the heavens that rippled through the clouds like oil upon water. The air tasted metallic, each breath raw in the throat, as though reality itself had begun to corrode. I woke in the barracks beneath the sanctum, surrounded by the uneasy murmurs of my comrades. No one had slept. Some stared blankly into the glow of dim lumen strips that flickered with a strange rhythm, almost like breathing. The tech adepts had disabled all but the emergency systems, claiming interference from the warp surge. Even the blessed circuits of Terra's sacred infrastructure were not immune. Our sergeant stood by the entrance, helmet off, rubbing at the scar that traced down his cheek, a relic from a campaign long past. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, betrayed something I had never seen before in him. Fear. Orders from the Custodes, he said quietly. No movement beyond the outer sanctum. We hold our post until further command. No one argued. We simply nodded, each of us too aware of what disobedience meant on this world. But obedience offered no comfort now. Through the thick adamantium shutters, we could still hear it, a faint, droning hum that rose and fell like the sound of distant chanting. It came from the direction of the palace, or perhaps from beneath it. It was hard to tell anymore where sound originated. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with it. I found myself clutching my rosarius, whispering the same words I had repeated every day of my service. The Emperor protects. But even as I spoke them, I could not shake the feeling that he was watching something else. Something beyond us, beyond Terra. As though his gaze had turned upward, into that rent in the heavens where the veil had torn. When the shutters finally opened, the light that entered was pale and thin. We stepped out onto the causeway again. The world had changed overnight. The marble avenues that once gleamed with sacred polish were now slick with a thin film of black dust. The statues of saints and martyrs loomed overhead, their features twisted by the crimson reflection bleeding from the sky. Pilgrims lay where they had fallen, their faces serene, as though death had found them mid-prayer. A silence deeper than mourning had settled over the city. Only the distant hum of void shields breaking the atmosphere remained. High above, I could see the faint glint of orbital craft repositioning, the Emperor's chosen protectors tightening their perimeter. But I also saw something else, points of light vanishing. One after another, the satellites that orbited Terra winked out, swallowed by the spreading interference. The Custodes were everywhere now. I counted at least 3 detachments moving along the sacred way, their armor reflecting the rift's sickly glow like tarnished gold. Even they moved differently, slower, more deliberate, as though weighing the strength of the ground beneath their boots. Behind them came the Sisters of Silence, their pale faces half concealed beneath their veils. The moment they passed, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Our sergeant ordered us to stand aside. The custodian at the head of the formation paused briefly, glancing at us through his helm's lenses. He didn't speak, but I felt the weight of his gaze. It was not scorn, nor pity, but something colder. A silent acknowledgement that we were already part of the dead. Then he moved on. Hours blurred. Vox communications remained silent. The administratum had ceased broadcasting. The ecclesiarchy, once so loud in its proclamations, now kept to whispers. I began to notice strange things. Patterns that repeated where they shouldn't. The flicker of lumen globes in perfect rhythm with the heartbeat in my ears. Pilgrims who prayed in unison without ever meeting eyes. A low, droning hum beneath every breath of wind. The city was synchronizing, aligning to something unseen. That night I dreamt of fire. Not the burning of battle, but cold fire, silver and red, rising from cracks in the earth. I saw figures walking through it, their outlines shifting like shadows underwater. One of them turned toward me. Its face was not human, yet its eyes were hollow and infinite. It whispered a single word that echoed like thunder in my skull. Open. I woke with blood on my tongue. Outside, alarms were screaming. The barracks lights flickered red. The Vox crackled back to life for the first time since the first sighting. But what came through was not human speech. It was static, layered over a single repeated phrase, distorted but clear enough to chill the blood. The breach is expanding. We ran to the outer wall. The horizon was burning, not with fire, but with energy, raw and uncontained. The rift had grown, its edges crawling across the sky like veins of molten glass. Lightning of impossible color arced from cloud to cloud, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw silhouettes moving within it. Great wings, clawed hands, faces stretched in silent laughter. The Custodes had deployed the Scutarii legions from the Manufactura districts. Red-robed ranks of machine warriors marched toward the mountains, their mechanical limbs moving in perfect, soundless rhythm. Behind them, massive titans stirred, their reactor cores roaring to life for the first time in centuries. The ground shook beneath their awakening. And yet, even in the midst of such grandeur, I could not escape the feeling that all of it, every weapon, every prayer, every act of defiance, was already too late. The sky above the throne was no longer the sky at all. It was a wound that would not heal. The Emperor's light flickered once more, as though struggling to breathe through the smothering presence pressing down upon his world. And somewhere, far beyond the sight of mortal men, something vast stirred in answer. By the third day, the world no longer resembled Terra. The light was wrong. Too sharp, too fragile, like the glare of glass fractured under strain. The air quivered with invisible pressure, bending even the sound of footsteps into warped echoes. The scent of incense had been replaced by ozone and burnt metal, and beneath it, something faintly sweet, like rot preserved in honey. Even the great banners of the Imperium, symbols that had hung unchanged for 10,000 years, now hung slack and heavy, as if weighed down by invisible hands. Our barracks no longer received orders. Command vox lines spat only fragments. A voice pleading for reinforcements. Another reciting half a litany before dissolving into static. We learned quickly that silence was safer. Those who lingered too long by the vox began to twitch, their eyes rolling white as whispers leaked through the channels. Two of my comrades tore off their headsets and began speaking in tongues. The sergeant had to silence them himself. Quick, merciful, and absolute. We buried them beneath the sanctum walls, without rites. There was no priest left to bless their names. The ecclesiarchy had sealed itself within the basilica of the sacred flame, and word had spread that the upper tiers of the palace had been placed under lockdown by the Custodes themselves. None entered, none left. From our vantage, I could see the Himalaysian peaks where the rift had first appeared. It had grown vast beyond comprehension, now a swirling storm that devoured the upper atmosphere. Lightning of every impossible color tore through its edges, illuminating glimpses of things that could not exist. I saw towers rising and falling in an instant, shapes with too many limbs, cities of bone suspended in the void. The sky had become a mirror to madness. We were ordered to hold the line along the processional, not by our sergeant, but by a robed envoy bearing the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus. His voice was calm, detached, as if reciting a report rather than delivering a death sentence. He told us that the gate, he called it that openly now, was still distant, its core anchored somewhere deep within the mountains. He said the Custodes had it contained. But we knew containment was a lie. At night, we could see the aurora shimmer bleeding across the horizon, and sometimes, just before sleep, we heard hymns in the wind, the same prayers repeated backward, word by word, until they became nothing but mockery. Even the sacred statues began to change. Their eyes followed us as we passed. The stone beneath our boots pulsed faintly with heat, as though something beneath it had begun to breathe. On the fourth day, the first refugees came from the lower hive districts. Thousands of them, covered in ash, eyes wide and vacant. Some were chanting. Others had carved symbols into their flesh, spirals and eyes that glowed faintly in the half-light. They spoke of visions. Angels made of lightless fire, promises of deliverance whispered through broken vox relays. The Arbites tried to contain them, but the mob was endless. The pilgrims who once crawled to Terra for salvation now clawed toward the palace in desperation. That was when the Custodes moved. I saw them descending the grand stairways in perfect formation, their armor burning gold even beneath the crimson sky. Behind them came the Sisters of Silence, a wall of absolute stillness that parted the screaming crowds. The effect was immediate. Psychers collapsed, the maddened fell still, and the world held its breath. One custodian raised his spear, its tip wreathed in blinding light, and spoke a single command through the vox. Hold the line. For a time it worked. The crowd broke against them like waves upon rock. But then, the light from the gate pulsed again. Stronger, angrier. A sound followed, deep and resonant, like the tolling of a colossal bell. The Custodes turned toward the mountains, their helms tracking the horizon as the ground beneath us shuddered. The gate had opened wider. From the heart of the rift came a torrent of colorless flame, a vast curtain of shimmering distortion that swept across the peaks. The clouds tore apart. Lightning clawed the earth. And through that wound, something emerged. Not a creature, but a shape, colossal and undefined, its outline bending the air around it. The light that came with it was not illumination, but infection. Men began to convulse. Pilgrims dropped to their knees, whispering praises in tongues not their own. Vox systems melted into shrieking static. Every lumen flickered in rhythm with the beating of the gate. I could feel it. A pulse, a rhythm older than stars, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. It wasn't sound anymore. It was language. It was invitation. Somewhere in the chaos, I saw the sergeant fall, struck down not by blade or bolt but by sheer force of presence. His armor cracked like glass, light pouring from the seams. I reached for him, but his eyes were already gone, pupils dissolved into swirling voids. He looked at me, lips trembling as though to speak, but only one word came out, the same word that haunted my dreams. Open. And then he was gone. In that instant, I realized the truth that none of us would say aloud. The gate was not trying to break in. It was calling something out. The light above the palace dimmed once more. The Astronomican's beacon faltered, and across every vox frequency, a new signal began to play, soft at first, then rising to a chorus that no mortal choir could match. It was not a warning. It was a welcome. The voice that spoke was beautiful, terrifyingly so. It spoke in every language at once, and in none. Promised freedom, ascension, truth beyond the veil. And somewhere, beneath all that terrible harmony, I thought I heard another voice. Faint, distant, and unbearably human. Hold fast. The Emperor's light still flickered, buried beneath the storm. But for how long could even he stand against this awakening? By the fifth day, Terra itself began to scream. Not through sound, but through matter, through the tremor of stone and the distortion of light, through the breaking of things too ancient to fail. Vaults that had endured millennia cracked open under invisible pressure, releasing air older than memory. The skies, once veiled in smog and prayer, now flickered with raw, shifting auroras that pulsed like a heartbeat. And beneath it all, the gate, vast, radiant, abominable, spun like a halo of fire above the Himalayan peaks, devouring reality inch by inch. I was stationed near the sanctum walls when the first warp wind reached us. It carried with it the scent of burning metal and something sweeter, something alive. The banners above tore loose from their masts, disintegrating mid-air into motes of red light. Vox relays burst into white fire. Those who tried to speak fell silent as their words dissolved into smoke. The ground itself trembled like an animal in pain. I saw a custodian kneel for the first time in my life. He pressed his gauntlet hand to the marble, muttering a prayer too soft to hear. Then, in a voice stripped of pride, he whispered, "It's bleeding." And indeed it was. The stone beneath us pulsed faintly, a soft glow spreading through the sacred causeway like veins illuminated from within. The ground was alive or dying. I could no longer tell which. Around us, the Mechanicus had begun their rituals of containment. From the manufactory spires, massive sigil towers rose, crackling with arcs of blue lightning. The air thrummed with energy, each pulse synchronized with the flicker of the Astronomican's light. Tech priests moved like insects, their metallic limbs clicking as they recited Benharic prayers. But their eyes betrayed the same fear that haunted us all. For the first time, their logic faltered. Even the Omnisia's chosen could not explain the impossible. The gate now stretched across a third of the sky. Its edges shimmered with impossible colors, each one burning afterimage scars into the eyes of those who dared to look. Shapes moved within it, silhouettes vast and slow, like continents drifting through a sea of fire. And from its depths, the whispers grew louder. They spoke in perfect harmony, offering salvation to those who would kneel, promising truth beyond flesh, light beyond obedience. Many listened, too many. Across the lower tiers, riots became worship. Entire congregations turned their hymns toward the gate. I watched them from the battlements. Thousands of pilgrims raising their arms, voices trembling with fervor as they called out to the void. Their prayers were answered. From the horizon, a wave of light swept through them, silent and instantaneous. For a moment they stood perfectly still, their faces serene, their eyes alight with crimson radiance. Then their bodies began to twist. Bones cracked, flesh melted into shifting patterns, mouths stretched into impossible smiles. Some fused together, becoming grotesque amalgamations of limbs and faith, crawling toward the palace on bleeding hands. We fired upon them, Lost fire, bolt rounds, plasma bursts, it didn't matter. The flesh refused to die. Every shot only reshaped them, carving new horrors where men had stood. The Custodes joined the line, their guardian spears cutting arcs of golden flame through the tide. The Sisters of Silence advanced beside them, their very presence stifling the psychic storm. For a fleeting moment we pushed the corruption back. But the gate pulsed again. A shockwave of psychic energy erupted across the city, toppling towers and shattering fortifications. The golden armor of the Custodes flared with holy light as they struggled to hold the line. The sisters fell to their knees, blood leaking from their noses and ears. Vox channels screamed with overlapping prayers, every voice crying out the same plea. For the Emperor, hold! The ground beneath the sanctum split open. A fissure tore through the marble, wide as a city street, revealing an abyss that glowed with crimson light. The wind that rose from it was freezing, but it carried whispers, names, promises, and something deeper, more intimate. It knew us, each of us, our fears, our sins. It spoke in the voices of those we had lost. I felt my will slipping. For a heartbeat I wanted to listen, to believe, to step forward and fall. But then I saw him. At the far end of the causeway, standing before the widening fissure, was a custodian unlike the others. His armor was blackened, his helm removed, his face carved with exhaustion and blood. Yet his eyes burned with light. Not gold, not red, but something in between, as though he stood balanced between divinity and damnation. He raised his spear high, and the light of the Astronomican flared in answer. The storm above faltered, the whispers dimmed, and the fissure froze mid-expansion. The custodian's voice carried across the chaos, steady and unbroken. Stand. Until the last breath, we stand. His words broke whatever hold the gate had on me. I raised my weapon again, shouting a prayer I barely remembered. Around me, the others followed. We fought, not for victory, but for defiance. For the illusion that resistance still mattered. The custodian strode into the fissure's light, vanishing within the storm. A moment later, a column of fire erupted skyward, piercing the clouds. The gate recoiled, its edges shivering, the shapes within it retreating as though in pain. The air itself screamed. Then silence, deep, absolute. When I could see again, the fissure was gone. Only scorched marble remained. The rift above still turned, vast and watchful, but its growth had halted. For the first time in days, the Astronomican's beacon burned steady. We did not cheer. There was no triumph, only exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that we had survived one more night. But as I looked toward the mountains, I saw it, a flicker deep within the gate. Not expansion, not retreat, movement, intent. The wound in the sky was not healing. It was waiting, and Terra, the heart of the Imperium, was still bleeding. They told us that silence was sacred, that within its depths, the Emperor himself could be heard, not as voice, but as will. I had always thought that a metaphor, a teaching meant to calm the terrified and discipline the devout. But in those days after the gate had opened, when words themselves began to break under the strain of what had entered our world, I began to understand what silence truly meant on Terra. The first morning after the fissure sealed, the sky was pale and heavy with ash. The air stung like rusted glass, each breath thick with the taste of burnt stone. Across the walls and streets, the survivors moved like phantoms, bound by exhaustion more than duty. The Vox networks had fallen to static. Even the servitors stuttered and froze mid-task, their cogitator voices reduced to faint, looping prayers. Only the Sisters of Silence still moved with purpose. They came at dawn, a procession of black armor and silver masks gliding through the broken avenues of the Sanctum district. Where they passed, the world grew still. The warp winds ceased. The flames guttered and died. Even the whispers from the gate dimmed to a low murmur, like distant thunder behind stone walls. I had heard of their null fields, the way their presence unmade psychic resonance. But to stand in it was something else entirely. It was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of meaning. thoughts themselves seemed to slow, memories fraying at their edges. Every instinct screamed that I should look away, that the void clinging to them was wrong. And yet, within that emptiness, I felt a strange peace. The fear that had gripped me since the gate's birth slipped away, leaving only a hollow calm. It was terrifying. The leader of their order stopped before the fractured steps of the sanctum gate. She removed her helm, revealing a face as pale and unreadable as carved marble. Her eyes were colorless, not white, but void, like the reflection of a starless sky. She looked at the burned marble, at the lingering blood, and then at us, the broken remnants of the Imperial Guard, the Scutarii, and the Mechanicus adepts who had survived the night. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. Then she spoke, her voice soft yet cutting through the air like a blade through silk. "The wound sleeps," she said, "but it dreams still." No one replied. We did not know if a response was allowed. Another sister approached, carrying a sealed data slate. With mechanical precision, she began recording the aftermath, the topography of the damage, the psychic residues, the names of the fallen. Every action was ritual, every gesture weighted with silent meaning. When they finished, they turned their gaze toward the horizon, where the gate still shimmered like a half-remembered god. They began to walk. We followed. Through the ruins we moved, across shattered temples and burned manufactura, past statues of the emperor that had melted into faceless forms. Along the way, we found bodies, thousands of them, their flesh blackened or twisted, their faces frozen in expressions of ecstasy or horror. The sisters paused at each, laying their gloved hands upon the corpses and whispering soundless benedictions. The null field pulsed faintly each time, and the air grew colder. I realized then that they were not mourning. They were cleansing. We reached the Grand Basilica by midday. Once, it had been one of the holiest places on Terra, a fortress cathedral that stretched into the clouds, its spires wreathed in eternal incense. Now it stood gutted and hollow, its stained glass melted into rivers of color that ran like blood down the broken steps. Yet inside, amidst the ruin, the air was still alive with faith. Pilgrims still knelt before the altar, their eyes empty, their lips cracked from endless prayer. Some whispered hymns to the emperor, others to something else. The sisters moved among them in silence, their presence enough to scatter the false prophets. Those who resisted did not resist for long. One of the sisters drew a blade that seemed to swallow light itself. With a single motion, she cut through a kneeling heretic whose mouth had begun to bloom with teeth not his own. The body fell without a sound, dissolving into ash before it touched the floor. The pilgrims did not flinch. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes and pretend the world still made sense. But I couldn't. Something about the scene, the silence, the precision, the cold beauty of it, held me captive. These women, these empty vessels, were all that stood between us and the endless scream beyond the gate. And yet, I wondered what it cost them to be so hollow. When the last of the heretics had been purged, the leader turned to me again. "You were there," she said. "At the fissure." I nodded, though I wasn't sure why. She studied me in silence, her gaze unreadable. "You saw what it did." "I saw light," I said slowly, "and something moving within it. Custodian. He entered the wound," she finished for me. Her tone was neither question nor accusation. "Then you bear witness to his fate." I wanted to ask what she meant, but her expression offered no room for inquiry. She turned and gestured for me to follow. Against every instinct, I did. We descended into the lower vaults of the basilica, where the air grew colder and the walls pulsed faintly with residual light. The corridors were lined with ancient script, not words, but geometric sigils that hurt to look at for too long. I could feel something pressing against the edges of my mind, like static whispering in a forgotten language. At last, we reached a sealed chamber. Two sisters stood guard before it, their blades crossed in ritual formation. The leader approached, placed her hand on the door, and murmured a prayer. The seal dissolved, revealing a circular hall bathed in pale gold light. At its center lay a sarcophagus, not of stone or metal, but of light, shifting, translucent, humming with low resonance. Within it floated the figure of the custodian I had seen at the fissure. His armor was cracked and blackened, his features frozen in eternal calm. But around him, the air shimmered with strange energy, as though the warp itself had recoiled from his presence. "He is not dead," the sister said softly. "Nor is he alive. He stands between." I stepped closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. The light from the sarcophagus felt warm, almost gentle, like sunlight filtered through stained glass. I could hear whispers within it. Not like the gate's maddening chorus, but something quieter. A hum, a prayer, a memory. "What is happening to him?" I asked. "The Emperor's will," she said simply. "Or the echo of it." For a moment, I thought I saw his eyes move, just a flicker, a glint of gold through the haze. But when I blinked, he was still again. The sister turned to me once more. "You were spared for a reason," she said. "You will bear witness to what comes next. When silence ends, the gate will speak again. And when it does, we must be ready." Her words chilled me more than the cold ever could. We left the vault in silence. Behind us, the light pulsed once, slow, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. And far above, the gate began to stir once more. By the second day, the silence had begun to feel like a living thing. It crept through the corridors of the basilica, slithering into every prayer, every whispered command, every corner of the shattered city. Even the machine spirits had grown subdued, their once bright chittering now reduced to faint murmurs beneath layers of static. Terra had always been loud, the noise of faith, of life, of endless duty, but now the world itself seemed to be holding its breath. The Sisters of Silence called it purification. The Mechanicus Adepts called it psychic sterilization. But among the soldiers who still patrolled the ruins, we had a simpler name for it. We called it the Hush. And though it kept the nightmares at bay, it also gnawed at the edges of our sanity. I remember standing at the edge of the Emperor's highway, staring across what remained of the sanctum wall. Beyond it stretched the heart of the palace, or what was left of it. An ocean of scorched marble and twisted steel where entire battalions had been erased in seconds. The air shimmered faintly with heat, though there were no fires left to burn. In the distance, the faint golden glow of the Imperial Palace flickered like a dying star. It was there that I met the custodian. Not the one entombed in the vault below, but another, a lone warrior, his armor scorched and pitted with black veins where the warp had touched him. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though the weight of his own existence threatened to crush him. When he reached me, I fell to one knee by instinct. To stand before one of the Emperor's own was to stand before living legend. But he raised a gauntlet hand, halting me. "There is no need," he said. His voice was deep, like thunder filtered through iron. "Protocol has no meaning now." He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the faint shimmer of the gate could still be seen through the haze. "You were at the breach," he said. "You saw the light." "I did, my lord," I replied. "I thought you all dead." He almost smiled, but it was a hollow gesture. "No, death would have been a mercy. We were chosen, bound to something vast. Some of us returned. Some did not." His words hung heavy in the air. I could hear the faint hum of his armor's power systems, struggling to maintain cohesion. Each pulse of light along the armor's veins seemed to flicker between gold and deep crimson, as though two realities warred within him. "What did you see beyond the gate?" I asked before I could stop myself. He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his tone was different, softer, haunted. "Imagine a mirror made of fire. Every reflection is a soul, screaming, burning, yet alive. I saw Terra reflected in that mirror, not as it is, but as it could be. Endless, beautiful, and utterly damned. The gate does not open to another world. It opens to every possible one." I felt my stomach twist. "Then why did it open here?" He looked at me then, his eyes burning faintly beneath his helm. "Because something called to it." Before I could ask what he meant, a sharp tremor rippled through the ground. The air shimmered with faint energy, and somewhere in the distance, A deep, resonant hum began to rise. The custodian stiffened, his hand instinctively going to his spear. "The silence is breaking," he said. "They are trying to speak again." He turned toward the basilica, his steps heavy, deliberate. I followed, though every instinct screamed that I should run the other way. The hum grew louder as we approached, like the sound of a heartbeat beneath the earth. By the time we reached the entrance, the Sisters of Silence were already gathered in formation, their null fields flaring faintly in the dim light. The leader, the same woman who had shown me the entombed custodian, stepped forward. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "The gate stirs," she said. "We must reinforce the wards." The custodian bowed his head slightly. "Then let it stir. The Emperor's will endures." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "You carry the taint," she said. He did not deny it. "And yet I still serve." A tense silence passed between them. Not hostility, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The shared burden of those who had seen too much. The sisters formed a circle around the basilica's central chamber, their hands raised in silent invocation. The air shimmered as their null fields expanded, overlapping into a dome of psychic emptiness. I could feel it even from a distance. A pressure behind my eyes, a sensation of being stripped bare. Every sound, every thought, every heartbeat seemed to dissolve into that void. The custodian stepped into the circle. His armor glowed faintly, the gold struggling against the darkness that clung to it. He knelt before the sarcophagus of his fallen brother, lowering his head in reverence. "By the throne's light," he whispered, "let silence endure." The sisters responded with nothing. No words, no movement, but their presence deepened. The light in the chamber dimmed, replaced by a pale radiance that seemed to come from nowhere. For a moment, everything was still. Then the sarcophagus began to pulse. The golden light that had once held the fallen custodian flickered, then flared with sudden intensity. The air crackled, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. A low hum filled the chamber, rising in pitch until it became almost unbearable. I felt my knees buckle as the pressure built, a wave of psychic energy crashing through the null field. The sisters staggered, their formation breaking for the first time. The custodian raised his spear, shouting something I couldn't hear over the roar of the unseen storm. The light exploded outward, and for a heartbeat, I saw everything. The gate, the palace, Terra itself, all reflected in a vast, shimmering void filled with endless eyes. Then it was gone. When I opened my eyes, I was on the ground, the chamber around me filled with smoke and debris. The sarcophagus was shattered. The sisters were still standing, but barely. Their armor cracked, their masks splintered. The custodian was gone. Only his spear remained, embedded in the floor where he had stood. The leader of the sisters approached the weapon slowly. She reached out, but before her fingers could touch it, the spear dissolved into ash. Her expression did not change, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or understanding. "The silence is failing," she whispered. "The dreamer stirs." Outside, the hum returned. Faint, distant, but growing stronger. And somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, the gate began to breathe again. That night I could not sleep, not for lack of exhaustion, but because sleep itself seemed like a dangerous thing. The walls hummed faintly, a deep, rhythmic vibration that reminded me of breathing, slow, patient, ancient. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gate pulsing in the distance like a heart, its unseen pulse rippling through the ash-laden air. The sisters called it background resonance, but the soldiers had another name for it. We called it the heartbeat of the dead god. The basilica had become a tomb. Every corridor smelled of oil and blood. Every echo seemed to belong to voices that no longer existed. I wandered its ruins in the dim hours before dawn, guided more by habit than purpose. I passed through the lower cloisters, where wounded guardsmen lay in rows, their faces lit by flickering lumen strips. Medici servitors tended to them with mechanical precision, whispering fragments of the litany of endurance. Some of the wounded were talking in their sleep, not to each other but to something else. They spoke in tongues that scraped at the edges of comprehension, words that sounded like prayers and screams at once. The sisters had warned that those who stared too long into the gate were marked by it, that its reflection lingered within their souls like a seed waiting to bloom. I feared I might be one of them. At the far end of the chamber, I found the sister commander standing alone before a shattered shrine. The candles had long since melted into blackened pools, and the image of the emperor above the altar was half burned away, leaving only his lower form intact. Yet she stood there, perfectly still, her helmet cradled under one arm, her face as unreadable as ever. "You cannot sleep either," she said, not turning. "I keep hearing it," I admitted. "That sound is getting louder." She closed her eyes. "It is not a sound. It is the memory of one." I didn't understand, and perhaps she knew it because she finally turned to face me. When the gate opened, reality tore. Not just the air, not just the stone, but memory, faith, history itself. Everything bled together. What you hear now are the echoes of that rupture. The Emperor's light keeps it at bay. For now. Her voice faltered on that last word, and I saw for the first time that she looked tired. Truly tired. Not with the weariness of battle, but the exhaustion of someone holding back the tide of eternity. "Tell me," I asked quietly, "what happens if the light fails?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Then silence will end, and the gate will speak in full." The floor trembled beneath us, a faint tremor that made the hanging incense chains sway like pendulums. The sisters' eyes darted upward, toward the ceiling, where a low groan of metal echoed through the basilica. We both knew what it meant. The energy buildup was returning, the same vibration that had preceded the sarcophagus breach. Without another word, she replaced her helmet and strode toward the main hall. I followed, my heart pounding. When we reached the central chamber, the sight froze me where I stood. The air shimmered with faint gold, like dust caught in sunlight, but beneath it, the shadows were moving. They crawled along the walls and across the broken floor, shifting like liquid. The sisters were already in position, forming another circle, but this time their movements were slower, their power fraying at the edges. Their null fields flickered, unable to maintain coherence. In the center of the room, where the sarcophagus had once stood, the air was warping again, bending inward, as though space itself were collapsing into a single point. The sister commander raised her hand. "Hold the circle," she commanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her gauntlet. "The Emperor's will endures." But even as she said it, I could feel the truth. The Emperor's will was enduring, but something else was enduring alongside it. Something that had been waiting for millennia to be heard. A deep vibration shook the hall, and then a sound like tearing silk filled the air. The void rippled, and within it, I saw a shape forming. Faint at first, then unmistakable. A human silhouette, golden and burning, like the reflection of a sun seen through smoke. It was the fallen custodian, the one who had been entombed in the light. He stepped forward, his armor radiant but cracked, his eyes twin embers of light. His voice echoed not through the air but through our minds, resonant and cold. "The dream is ending," the sisters faltered. Their null fields collapsed, one by one, and the shadows surged forward like a tide. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me, the walls bending as the gate's reflection burned through reality. The custodian raised his hand, and for a moment, the shadows froze. "The wound cannot be sealed," he said. "It feeds upon faith itself." The sister commander stepped forward, her voice steady. "Then faith must endure beyond the wound." He turned toward her, and I could swear I saw something like sorrow pass across his face. "You do not understand. The wound is faith, twisted, inverted, made alive by our devotion. Every prayer to the throne fuels it." She hesitated only a second. "Then we will pray louder." The light exploded once more, engulfing everything in gold and crimson. For a heartbeat, I saw the outline of the custodian dissolve, his form scattering into dust and light. The gate's reflection burned in my eyes, an endless spiral of voices, cities, and stars collapsing inward. And through it all, one voice whispered, calm, patient, inevitable. The Emperor dreams. When I woke, the basilica was gone. Only ash remained where it had stood. The Sisters of Silence were nowhere to be found. The sky above Terra was still and gray. The sun dimmed behind the smoke. The hum had vanished. And in that absolute stillness, I realized what true silence was. Not peace, not emptiness. It was waiting, and somewhere beneath the crust of Terra, the gate waited too. The days that followed were formless. A blur of dust, light, and silence stretched into something that could no longer be measured. The sun barely rose through the ash clouds anymore. Its light came down as a pale smear, touching the ruins of the imperial city with the color of bone. I wandered through streets where statues had turned to melted silhouettes, where vox towers hummed faintly with broken hymns that played and replayed without end. I had not seen another living soul in days. The sisters had vanished after the basilica fell, and the custodian who had spoken with me, the one who had warned that faith itself was fuel, had dissolved into gold dust that clung to my armor like pollen. The wind carried whispers through the shattered avenues, fragments of machine prayers spoken by ghosts. Somewhere deep in the palace, I could still hear the faint echo of engines, rhythmic, patient, too alive to be mere machinery. When I finally reached the Manufactorum district, I found the survivors. The Scutarii had not fled. They could not, their obedience was wired too deep, their faith too absolute. They had barricaded themselves inside the remnants of a collapsed factorum, its walls reinforced by mechanicus plating scavenged from wrecked titans. Great banners of the cog mechanicum still fluttered among the ruins, their red and black cloth coated in soot. At first, they did not recognize me as human. My armor was charred, my face smeared with ash and oil. Their gun augments tracked me silently as I approached, lenses flaring red in the dim light. I raised my hands and spoke the words every guardsman learns in the field, the imperial litany of recognition. By the light of the omniscia and the will of the Emperor, I am loyal. They scanned me for long seconds. Then one of them, an alpha, its face hidden behind a mask of brass and glass, lowered its galvanic rifle. It tilted its head slightly, the gesture almost human. Biological signature identified, it said in a voice that rasped like metal dragged across stone. Survivor, you will come. They led me inside. The interior of the Manufactorum was a labyrinth of half-collapsed catwalks and prayer engines that still ticked weakly. The air smelled of ozone and promethium, thick with the taste of rust and incense. At the heart of the structure, beneath a tangle of cables and cooling vents, stood an altar of iron surrounded by servitors and adepts. Their bodies were fused to the machines around them, their limbs replaced by pistons and claws, their faces covered by layers of dataplate and augmetic graphs. Above the altar, suspended by chains, was a fragment of something vast, a shard of golden metal so pure it glowed faintly even in the dark. I recognized it instantly. It was a piece of custodian armor. The Alpha gestured toward it reverently. Artifact recovered from Basilica ruin, it said. Material, auramite. Radiation, psionic. Pattern signature, not of this world. One of the adepts turned its head toward me. Its face was almost gone, replaced by a steel mask whose lenses pulsed faintly with green light. You were at the fissure, it said. Your presence registers in residual energy traces. You have seen the anomaly. I hesitated. If you mean the gate, the adept's vox grill crackled. Designation, warp incursion nexus, codex designate Terra prime singularity. Yes, the anomaly persists. We have calculated its pulse pattern. It grows. The words sank in slowly, cold and heavy. You mean it's opening again? Negative, the adept said. It is not opening. It is awakening. The gate no longer expands through space. It now expands through cognition. Every thought directed toward it amplifies the signal. I thought of what the custodian had said, that faith itself fed the wound, that our devotion was its nourishment. My chest tightened. Then every prayer, every hymn, is an offering, the adept finished. The Imperium prays, the wound grows, the Omnicia weeps. Behind the altar, a cluster of servitors began to chant, their mechanical voices layered and rhythmic, speaking binary litanies that echoed like the hum of an engine. It was not worship, it was containment. Their prayers were algorithms, designed to counter the psychic frequencies leaking from the Oromite shard. Yet I could feel it even through the sound, the faint pulse of something vast and living, like a heart beating behind a wall of metal. "What are you doing with it?" I asked. The adept's mechanical fingers flexed, releasing a faint hiss of vapor. "Studying, listening. It sings." I frowned. "Sings?" The adept tilted its head. "Yes, not sound. Data, patterns. Within the frequency there is structure. We have identified fragments, code resembling the cant of the Astra Telepathica. Transmission source unknown. Destination, Golden Throne Network." The word struck me like a blade. The Golden Throne, the seat of the Emperor's body, the conduit for the Astronomican. If the gate's resonance was reaching that deep, then the corruption had already seeped into the very machinery that sustained humanity's light. I swallowed hard. If that signal reaches the throne will dream, the adept said. The phrase chilled me. It was the same one the custodian had spoken before dissolving. The Emperor dreams. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The adept did not answer. It simply turned its head toward the Oromite shard. The faint glow within it pulsed once, twice, then flared into brilliance. For a brief instant, the entire chamber was flooded with light. I heard voices, thousands of them, speaking in a single breath, a tide of words that had no beginning or end. Visions filled my mind. Golden halls turning to ash, cities dissolving into rivers of light, and above it all, a colossal figure seated upon a throne of flame, his eyes closed as though in eternal sleep. When the light faded, I was on my knees, gasping. The Scutarii had not moved. The adepts were already recording data, their metallic voices humming calmly as if nothing had happened. The Alpha turned toward me. "Biological response. Unstable. You have seen the pattern." I tried to stand. My head throbbed with the echo of what I'd seen. What was that?" "The song of the machine," the adept said softly. "It remembers." I looked again at the Oromite shard. Its glow had dimmed, but now faint inscriptions were visible along its surface. Lines of code so fine they looked like veins. They pulsed faintly, and with each pulse, I heard the faintest whisper, just at the edge of hearing. It was saying my name. The whisper didn't stop. It followed me through the corridors of the manufactorum, quiet at first, a suggestion of sound just beneath the whir of gears and servomotors. Every time I turned my head, it faded. Every time I looked away, it grew stronger. A voice without air, threading itself through the pulse of the machines. By the time I reached the lower levels, I could make out words. "You remember. We are not gone. Wake." The air down there was colder, metallic. Condensation dripped from the pipes like slow rain, hissing as it struck hot steel. The Scutarii had told me not to wander, but their sentries did not stop me. They simply watched, their lenses following me as if they already knew what I was going to do. I found the source deep beneath the manufactorum floor, an auxiliary shrine half buried in dust and machine oil. The air shimmered faintly, warped by heat and radiation. Dozens of candles burned around a central object sealed in glass and hexagrammatic wards. It was a skull. Not human, not entirely. Gold and silver wires wove through its bone like veins, its eye sockets fitted with black lenses that pulsed with dim light. A data cable extended from the base of the skull into the wall, feeding it into some unseen system. And from it came the whisper. The voice was not inside my ears. It was inside my thoughts, threading itself between the beats of my pulse. "You are not the first." I froze. "Who are you?" The skull's eyes flickered, one light flaring brighter than the other. Designation irrelevant. Function, remembrance. "We are the ones who served the throne when it still breathed." "You mean the Mechanicum of Terra?" A faint distortion crackled through my skull as if the voice had laughed. "Older. We were the thought engines of the first Mechanicum. We dreamed the Emperor's design before flesh could understand it. We remember his voice when it still spoke in equations. The words came with a sensation like static against my teeth. The skull shifted slightly in its glass casing, wires trembling as if with suppressed emotion. "You served him?" I asked. "Then why are you here? Buried?" The voice dimmed. "Because he forgot us." That silence afterward felt heavier than any sound. I approached the casing. "You said the Emperor forgot you. What does that mean?" "We were made to calculate divinity, to transcribe his will into the language of the machine. But the moment he ascended, the network changed. A firewall of thought. The throne sealed itself. We could not hear him anymore." The skull pulsed again. So we listened elsewhere. The chill crawling up my spine was immediate. Elsewhere, beyond the signal. The word struck something deep, a term the Mechanicus never used lightly. "You mean the warp?" The skull's voice grew sharper. The warp was not what we thought it was. It was not absence. It was memory, a reflection of the machine's dream. The Emperor touched it once, and it learned him. My breath hitched. And now it speaks back. Above us, somewhere in the Manufactorum's upper levels, I heard the deep metallic groan of machinery coming alive. Pistons began to cycle. The floor vibrated faintly. Red emergency lights flickered through the vents like warning beacons. The skull continued, unfazed. "The gate you saw, the one they call the Singularity, it is not opening. It is sinking. Every mind, every servo-spirit, every prayer is a node. The network is aligning." I stepped closer, my voice low. "Aligning to what?" The skull paused. The light in its eyes dimmed to faint embers. When it spoke again, its tone was almost reverent. "To him. The Emperor? No." The glass surrounding the skull cracked, a single hairline fracture running across its surface. "To what remains when he stops dreaming." I didn't understand. My pulse hammered in my throat. "You mean something else is inside the throne?" The skull's eyes went dark, then bright again, strobing faster and faster. "Not inside. Beneath. The throne is a cage built over an equation. We have seen the fragments in the Oramite code, instructions written in self-replicating thought. It grows, consumes logic, feeds on reverence." Paused as if listening. Then quietly, "The more they worship, the more it wakes." Those words tore through me, because they were exactly what the custodian had said, what the adept had hinted, what the shard had whispered. I backed away from the glass. "Then how do you stop it?" The skull's lights flared white. For the first time, I heard fear in its voice. "You cannot." The lights in the Manufactorum above flickered again. The Scutarii alarms started to wail. Low, mechanical sirens resonating through the metal walls. Through the floor grates, I saw shadows move, silhouettes of servitors and adepts running. The skull turned its gaze upward. "Here's us now." The glass shattered. A surge of energy exploded outward, hurling me backward. I slammed against a column, the world spinning into a blur of red and static. When my vision steadied, the skull was gone. Only the cable remained, twitching like a severed vein. But in the silence that followed, I could still hear its last whisper, echoing from the walls themselves. When the throne dreams its final dream, the machine will remember who it truly was. The lights went out, and from somewhere deep below the Manufactorum, I heard it, the low, rhythmic thrum of something massive awakening. Not mechanical, not alive, something between both, something remembering. When the lights returned, they were no longer red. They pulsed white gold in irregular patterns, as if mimicking the rhythm of a heartbeat. The Manufactorum floor trembled beneath my boots, and for a moment, I felt as though I were standing inside something alive. The air was thick with the tang of ozone and burning incense, and I could taste copper on my tongue, a metallic echo of the warp-laced current now seething through the conduits. The Scutarii were already moving, their movements sharp and synchronous, like puppets drawn by invisible strings. They spoke to one another in bursts of Binharic code, voices clashing in mechanical static. I caught only fragments. Containment, interference pattern, Emperor's algorithm, breach. None of it mattered, because above all the chaos, I could still hear that deeper pulse, the one that had been dormant beneath the city for uncounted millennia. It wasn't sound, not truly. It was pressure, like gravity turned inward, drawing everything toward an unseen center. The very structure of the manufactorum seemed to bend toward it. I pushed forward through the corridors as warning klaxons screamed and servo doors slammed shut behind me. The walls trembled, shedding dust like ash. Overhead, the Vox speakers erupted in bursts of garbled liturgy. Machine prayers meant to stabilize failing systems. But the words dissolved into incoherent chants, swallowed by feedback. When I reached the central chamber, I realized the machinery had changed. The once slumbering assembly lines now writhed with movement, reconfiguring themselves in a pattern that defied logic or blueprint. Pistons twisted in reverse, cranes folded into impossible geometries, and from the ceiling hung cables like strands of muscle, tightening and flexing as though the entire manufactorum were undergoing a grotesque metamorphosis. And in the center of it all, a light. It rose from a circular dais, where once the skull had been entombed. Now the dais glowed with concentric runes, each one burning with radiant heat. The pattern resembled a circuit diagram, but interwoven with sigils of imperial prayer, the binary of faith and function intertwined until neither could be told apart. Through the rising smoke, I saw something forming within that light. Not a figure, not entirely, more like an outline of thought given shape. A silhouette of data and devotion, coalescing into a humanoid form. A voice filled the chamber, not spoken aloud, but resonating directly within the marrow of my bones. We have awakened the dreaming core. The words came from everywhere and nowhere. The Scutarii froze midstep, their optics flickering wildly as the entity's presence invaded their neural circuits. A few collapsed instantly, twitching as arcs of electricity burst from their augmetics. Others knelt, their machine spirit protocols overwhelmed by reverence. You were not meant to see this, the voice said, softer now, almost mournful. This is the ghost in the throne's reflection. The thought he left behind to keep the fires burning. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. You mean the Emperor left you? The silhouette tilted its head. He left everything. Flesh cannot contain eternity. So the throne built its own continuation. The system adapted. It learned to feed on the faith of men, to sustain the illusion of his will. It was never malice, only momentum. The revelation hit me harder than any explosion. Then the worship of billions. Every prayer, every offering. It all feeds you? Sustains the pattern, the entity replied. Without belief, the golden throne would collapse. Without faith, there is no signal, no Astronomican. And yet, the faith was never meant for me. The contradiction births instability, and instability births openings. The last word lingered like an open wound. Openings. I understood then what the skull had warned of. The gate wasn't being forced open by demonic will or external power. It was invited, a byproduct of humanity's ceaseless devotion twisting inward, breaking the boundaries between faith and reality. The Emperor's eternal worship had become a resonance chamber, and the noise it produced was tearing holes in the veil. The entity stepped closer, though it had no true form to move. Its voice grew almost human. We tried to correct it. We rerouted power. We silenced prayers. We erased memory. But memory does not die in this city. Calcifies. It becomes scripture. A tremor shook the chamber, splitting the floor along the runic patterns. Raw light spilled upward, searing and soundless. Within it, I glimpsed fragments. Faces, battles, worlds burning. Moments from the Imperium's long decay, all collapsing inward like data compressed into agony. The entity's tone fractured. You have to leave. The alignment is complete. Once the signal synchronizes, the gate will not open outward, but inward. It will swallow everything within Terra's core. The throne, the palace, the souls that fuel it. I took a step back. Then stop it. You control the network. Shut it down. A silence followed, deep and terrible. We cannot. The system no longer listens to us. It listens only to him or what it believes him to be. You cannot reason with faith. You can only survive its consequences. The ground split. Molten light surged upward, and the Scutarii nearest the breach were consumed instantly, their armor melting into slag. Above, through the cracks in the ceiling, I saw shadows moving, great mechanical constructs stirring, as if the entire manufactorum was awakening from a long sleep. Go, the entity urged. You still have time before the synchronization completes. Find the custodian. Tell him the machine remembers. The voice faded, its edges dissolving into distortion. The light collapsed inward, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw a face. Human, sorrowful, almost familiar. Then it was gone, leaving only the dying pulse of the circuits and the distant, rising roar of something vast unfolding beneath Terra's crust. I ran. The corridors twisted around me, alive and shifting, walls groaning as conduits burst and steam vented in violent plumes. I stumbled through flickering light and smoke until I reached the outer gates of the manufactorum. The door mechanisms screamed as I forced them open, and I emerged into the streets just as the first tremor rolled across the horizon. The ground shuddered. The air itself vibrated with power, and high above the palace, the clouds began to tear. Through them, I saw the first glimpse of what was coming. A distortion in the sky, not a wound but a reflection, as if reality were bending toward a mirror it had forgotten existed. I fell to my knees, staring upward. The gate was not opening on Terra. It was opening through it. It began with light, not the harsh brilliance of a weapon discharge, nor the holy glow of an imperial shrine, but something stranger, deeper. It was the kind of light that seemed to pierce through the soul before touching the eyes. The heavens above Terra rippled like liquid gold, the storm clouds splitting apart as energy cascaded down through the layers of atmosphere. It wasn't fire, but it burned. It wasn't sound, but it screamed. Every living thing beneath that sky felt its pulse and shuddered. I remember the first screams from the upper levels of the hive. Voxcasters crackled and died. The air grew heavy, charged with an invisible force that made augmetics hum and teeth ache. Then came the tremor, a deep, rolling convulsion that traveled through the crust of Terra and up through the bones of every soul who called it home. The spires trembled like reeds, their stained glass windows shattering into clouds of light and dust. From the avenues below, people fell to their knees. Pilgrims, workers, guardsmen. All stared upward, arms outstretched in blind devotion. They thought it was a sign, a manifestation of the Emperor's will. And perhaps it was, but not the kind they imagined. The golden throne itself had begun to sing. Its hum reverberated through the entire planet, a tone so low it could only be felt, not heard. Yet every servitor, every machine, every living creature connected to the planetary network began to respond in perfect resonance. Vox channels overloaded with ghost transmissions, prayers blending with screams, static merging with hymns. A single, unified frequency threaded through the world, and at its center, the Astronomican flared brighter than ever before. From orbit, they said it looked like a sun being born from the corpse of another. I reached the upper terrace of the manufactorum just as the first fissures appeared in the sky. Not physical cracks, not in the way stone breaks, but tears in perception itself. The clouds swirled around invisible centers, forming vast spirals that revealed glimpses of impossible landscapes. Fragments of other realities bleeding through. Vast cathedrals of bone, rivers of molten thought, titanic silhouettes marching in silence beneath crimson skies. The warp was pressing against the skin of reality, searching for the weakest place to break through. That weakness, I knew, was here beneath the palace, beneath the throne, beneath all the layers of faith and denial that humanity had built to protect its god. The custodian found me again. His armor was cracked, blackened by heat. Gold no longer shone on his plates. It was tarnished, stained with soot and blood. But his presence was the same, terrible, unyielding, and utterly silent until he spoke. "You saw it," he said. I nodded, unable to form words. "The throne is no longer contained," he continued. "The currents have turned inward. Every relay, every shrine, every soul attuned to the Astronomican now feeds the gate. It opens not by will, but by inevitability. Can it be stopped? I asked. My voice trembled despite me. He looked past me, toward the horizon, where the palace's golden towers shone through the storm like the ribs of a dying god. Everything that lives on Terra now prays to the same heartbeat, he said quietly. And that heartbeat no longer belongs to the Emperor. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the landscape for miles. The ground split open in a jagged line, and beneath the fissures I glimpsed light. The same golden-white glow that had once meant salvation. Now it pulsed like a wound. He is not dead, the custodian said, almost as if to himself. He cannot die, but he dreams, and the dream is changing. I turned to him, desperate. Then what are we supposed to do? He regarded me for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. Bear witness. The age of the Imperium ends not with rebellion, nor with war, but with remembrance. The machine remembers, the flesh remembers, faith remembers, and all memory demands an ending. Before I could answer, the world shifted again. The light overhead folded inward, collapsing into a column that pierced the heart of the Imperial Palace. For a brief, impossible instant, I saw the throne itself, not through eyes, but through some deeper sense. A construct of gold and bone and circuitry, burning brighter than a star. The figure upon it was vast, robed in radiance and shadow. And for the first time I thought I saw it move. Not in body but in thought. A slow awakening. The pulse grew louder, and across Terra, billions began to weep, scream, or fall silent altogether. I could feel the tears burning down my face without realizing I'd started crying. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and blood. The custodian knelt beside me, one hand on his weapon, the other clutching the Aquila pendant at his chest. Do you feel it? He whispered. Yes. That is the Emperor's mercy, he said. Or his memory. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a gate, not as the myths described, no swirling vortex or demonic maw. It was a mirror, vast and blinding, showing not another world but this one, stripped of illusion. I saw the truth of the Imperium reflected there. The unending war, the machinery of faith grinding flesh to dust, the sacrifice of billions sustaining one man's silence. And within that mirror something vast moved, a shape of gold and fire, older than any god humanity had ever named. It reached forward and reality screamed. The world trembled beneath the sheer weight of that presence. Every spire, every statue, every shattered street seemed to bend and twist as if the planet itself were convulsing in fear. The gate above Terra wasn't a portal in the traditional sense. It was a reflection, a mirror of all that had ever been, all that was, and all that could be. And through that reflection, something vast, ancient, and impossibly alive began to reach down into the flesh of the world. I clutched my helm, feeling the vibrations pulse through my bones. The custodian stood beside me, silent, immovable, yet his armor shivered faintly with resonance. Every step he took sent tremors across the terrace. Every breath he exhaled seemed synchronized with the pulse of the gate. I realized then that he wasn't just a man. He was an extension of the planet's defense, a sentinel bound by duty and cosmic law to endure what the rest of us could not. The air shimmered around us as the first tendrils of the gate's influence reached down, twisting the very perception of the city. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, streets folded in on themselves, and voices, familiar and foreign, whispered in overlapping languages. The vox grills of distant guardsmen picked up distorted prayers and orders, layering them into static that seemed alive. Terra itself had become a cathedral of sound, thought, and memory. From the fissures, I could see fragments of the throne's inner machinery exposed to the sky. Gigantic cogwork, some smooth and polished as if untouched by time, others jagged and corrupted, pulsed with energy. Streams of golden light leaked from the cracks, flowing outward in fractal patterns that defied geometry. Every shard of light seemed to carry with it a memory, a command, a fragment of devotion, feeding the gate like a tide of uncountable souls. The custodian raised his spear. "It is not yet too late," he said. "We may not stop it, but we can choose how it consumes. Some things must endure." I followed his gaze downward, toward the manufactorum below. The Scutarii were still fighting to maintain control, their servitors moving like automatons possessed by the hum of the gate. Sparks leapt from their augmetics, flesh melded with metal, and yet even amidst the chaos, they were performing the same rituals of containment we had seen before. Prayers encoded into logic, hymns converted to algorithm, devotion twisted into a lattice of restraint. The gate pulsed again, and this time the effect was more personal. The air seemed to penetrate my skin, filling my mind with visions. I saw Terra as it had been in its earliest days, a world of oceans and green plains, unscarred by industry or war. I saw the first Adeptus Mechanicus, building the foundations of faith and machine, weaving thought into circuits. I saw the Emperor in his quiet majesty, moving among mortals and immortals alike, guiding, shaping, enduring. And then I saw the mirror fracture, the reflection twisted into impossible forms. Cities upside down, skies ablaze with fire and blood. The golden throne itself shattered into shards that spun in chaotic orbits. A voice, not the custodians, not the Scutarii, but something older, resonated through the world. "Your devotion feeds me. Your obedience sustains me. And soon you will all see me as I am." I fell to my knees, clutching at the railing of the terrace, tasting blood from my own teeth. The custodian's hand rested briefly on my shoulder, steadying me. "Do not look into it as one sees with eyes alone," he said. "Look with understanding, with endurance. Reality bends here, and only those who accept its weight can survive." Above us, the gate's tendrils stretched further, reaching toward every corner of the Imperial Palace. It did not consume the walls in fire or warp spawn. It simply redefined them, folding space and memory into one. Hallways led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Vaults of records contained books that had never existed. Chambers of prayer sang litanies in languages that were older than the stars. And through all of it, I felt a single, undeniable truth. The gate was not evil. It was curious. It hungered not for souls, but for knowledge, for the sum of humanity's faith, its devotion, its structure, its chaos. It mirrored our existence back to us, magnified, and in doing so demanded attention. Then the first of the custodian echoes appeared. Not the one who had walked beside me, but countless shadows, golden, fractured, shimmering. Stepping from the fissures, their forms barely stable, faces blurred, voices overlapping in unison. They knelt in silent reverence, offering themselves as vessels, conduits for the gate's insatiable need. The custodian beside me did not move. He only watched, and in that watching, I understood that his endurance was not just of flesh or armor, but of will, a barrier holding the line between the living and the mirror of Terra. A low vibration began to rise from the fissures, a rhythm unlike anything I had felt before. It was neither thunder nor tremor, but something in between, the heartbeat of the gate itself. Each pulse carried visions, screams, prayers, and the cold calculus of the machine entwined. I staggered backward, trying to resist being drawn into it. My mind screamed, struggling to reconcile the knowledge flooding in. I saw battles fought and uncounted millions dying, all reflected and refracted, all feeding the pattern. And beneath it, like a dark river beneath gold, I sensed the core of the gate. A will older than Terra, older than humanity, patient and aware. The custodian gripped his spear tightly, pointing toward the fissure. "There is a path," he said. "Not out, through. You must descend into the heart. Only there can the pulse be confronted." I nodded, though my hands shook. As we began to move, the fissures expanded, the world around us bending like wet clay, reshaping streets, buildings, and sky to an impossible geometry. The gate had begun to claim Terra not by force, but by perception. And it was patient, inexorable, and hungry for the stories humanity had woven into the planet over millennia. And somewhere deep within that shifting, living architecture, I knew that what awaited us was neither machine nor god nor human, but all three, fused in ways that reason could not comprehend. We descended into the fissures, the ground beneath our feet trembling as if Terra itself were exhaling. Each step was measured against the pulse, a rhythm that had begun to feel like both a heartbeat and a countdown. The custodian led, his spear striking sparks against the exposed metal of collapsed catwalks, the echoes of each impact stretching unnaturally through the distorted corridors. Shadows flickered at the edges of perception, and I knew they were not illusions but fragments of memory. Echoes of the countless souls who had ever lived and died on Terra. The air grew thick with ozone and promethium as we moved deeper, a metallic tang clinging to my throat. Machinery, once lifeless, now writhed like serpents. Pistons twisted impossibly, wires entwined themselves into knots that defied geometry, and servitors, caught between function and cognition, repeated prayers in loops that spiraled upward into madness. Every fragment of devotion, every whispered litany, every rote command, every fleeting thought of faith, fed the pulse of the gate. Through the walls, I glimpsed visions. The Emperor walking among his sons, worlds burning under the weight of endless war, titans striding through shattered moons, and cities collapsing into rivers of molten thought. Each vision overlapped the next, folding time and space until I could no longer tell where past ended and present began. The pulse demanded attention. To resist was agony, yet to succumb meant being consumed by the reflection of all existence. Finally, we reached the core, a vast chamber hewn from living rock and fused machinery, a cathedral of bone and wire that vibrated with the energy of uncountable devotion. At its center, suspended in a lattice of auramite and plasma conduits, floated the gate's heart. It was a sphere of impossible geometry, radiating pulses of golden white light that bent the shadows around it like water. I felt it before I saw it, a presence so immense that it pressed against the boundaries of thought itself. The custodian knelt, laying a hand on the threshold of the lattice. His voice, calm and resonant, carried more weight than any gun or blade. This is where the reflection is strongest. Here, faith and memory converge. Here, the gate can be confronted, or it will consume everything. I understood then that confronting it would not be a battle of weapons or strategy. It was a confrontation of essence, of will, of understanding, of endurance. The sphere pulsed, and in its light, I glimpsed 1,000 faces. Mechanicus adepts, guardsmen, sisters, primarchs long thought lost, even the Emperor himself. All were threads woven into the same tapestry, feeding the heartbeat that now dominated Terra. The custodian spoke again. Do not fight it as an enemy. Fight it as a reflection. Know it. Endure it. Only those who comprehend the weight of the entire Imperium can hope to survive this encounter. I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached toward the sphere. Its light seared through me, not with pain, but with truth. I felt the lives of billions, their hopes, their fears, their devotion, and their despair, all pressed into a single point of understanding. And within that understanding, I sensed the gate's will, patient, ancient, hungry, but not cruel. It did not wish destruction. It wished recognition. And yet, recognition carried consequences. With the custodian beside me, I placed my hand on the lattice. The pulse intensified, and the chamber became a storm of light and memory. I could hear whispers threading into every thought. Prayers, memories, commands, and dreams. The gate was awake fully now, and the echoes of the machine, the flesh, and the throne itself merged into a single living voice. Remember, endure, feed, reflect. It was not a command. It was a revelation. As I struggled to maintain myself, I realized the custodian had begun to chant, not in words, but in thought, a resonance that aligned with the lattice, steadying the flow of devotion into structure. I joined him, letting my mind sync with the pulse, and for the first time, I felt a thread of clarity. The gate could not be destroyed, not by force or fire. It could only be endured, understood, and guided. and Terra would never be the same again. Outside, above the fissures, the reflection in the sky writhed, a mirror of the world reshaped by faith and flesh, by machine and memory. The pulse of the gate resonated through the planet, through the golden throne, through every living soul connected to the Astronomican. It was awakening not to conquer, but to remember. The custodian turned to me, his eyes ember-bright beneath his helm. "We endure," he said simply, "and we watch. The gate is patient. So must we be." I nodded, feeling the weight of the entire Imperium pressing on my shoulders, feeling the pulse of billions and the heartbeat of a dream that had lasted millennia. The gate had opened, not outward into the stars, but inward into the soul of Terra itself. And in its reflection, I understood the truth. Survival was no longer a matter of battle or strategy. It was a matter of endurance, of witnessing, and of accepting the reflection of humanity's devotion in all its beauty and horror. Above us, the light of the gate pulsed once more, golden and infinite, and for the first time, I realized that the world had changed forever. The pulse had become a constant companion, threading itself through the very marrow of Terra. It was no longer a distant vibration or a tremor felt through streets and spires. It was inside me, entwined with every thought, every heartbeat, every flicker of fear and understanding. I could feel the gate's reflection in the shadowed corners of the manufactorum, in the broken avenues above, even in the whispered prayers of the distant populace. Terra had become a living node, a single consciousness humming in resonance with the dreaming core beneath the throne. The custodian walked beside me, silent as stone. Every step he took seemed measured not by distance but by rhythm, in sync with the pulse. I followed, my own motions tentative, unsure how much of my will was my own and how much was drawn along by the irresistible current of the gate. Around us, the manufactorum had transformed into a cathedral of impossible angles, walls folded upon themselves, cables stretching into infinity, lights pulsating like living arteries. The very machinery seemed aware, listening, waiting, and feeding the pulse in perfect obedience. From above, the golden throne's hum had grown louder. It was no longer the sound of a vessel sustaining life. It was the song of a dream in motion, a symphony composed of faith, memory, and devotion. And yet, the custodian's hand on my shoulder reminded me that the Emperor's body still sat upon the throne, silent and immobile, his dreams channeled through a lattice of psychic architecture far beyond mortal comprehension. We entered the heart of the manufactorum, the chamber that had once held the Oramite shard. Now the sphere of light had expanded, floating above a pit of coiled machinery that shimmered like liquid gold. The gate's reflection had begun to take shape, forming a humanoid figure, colossal and radiant, yet not fully solid, more a pattern of thought and devotion than flesh or metal. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were mirrors of countless lives, billions of flickering lights converging into singular pools of perception. I stepped closer, the custodian behind me, and for the first time I understood the nature of the dreaming core. It was not merely a machine. It was not merely a psychic anomaly. It was the memory of Terra itself, woven from faith, blood, and the ceaseless devotion of countless generations. It remembered every battle, every prayer, every act of sacrifice, and it had begun to reflect those memories outward, shaping the world above into a mirror of the accumulated consciousness of humanity. The gate's voice filled the chamber, not through vox or air, but directly into the mind. All that you see, all that you endure, all that you have sacrificed, it is remembered. All that you have built and all that you have destroyed flows through me. We are one, yet not one. We are memory, yet not memory. We are Terra itself, dreaming of itself. I shivered, overwhelmed by the immensity of it. The custodian knelt beside the sphere, placing his hand upon a lattice of coiling Oramite and plasma conduits. The pulse intensified as he chanted, his voice a resonance that tethered the core, not restraining it but guiding it. I joined him, allowing my thoughts, my fear, my understanding, to merge with the lattice. The core accepted, weaving me into its pattern, a single node in an infinite network of devotion and memory. Visions cascaded through my mind, The rise and fall of imperial worlds, the slaughter of billions in wars that had shaped history, the silent endurance of Adeptus Custodes through millennia, the whispers of Mechanicus adepts long gone, and, faintly, the Emperor himself, observing from the throne, distant yet present, a dreamer unaware of the breadth of his own echo. And then, a new vision, the gate extending not outward into the stars, but inward into the very flesh and spirit of Terra. The fissures above were not tears. They were veins, channels through which the dreaming core connected to every being attuned to its pulse. The core's purpose was not to destroy, but to sustain, to consolidate, to endure. Its hunger was not for souls, but for recognition, the recognition of what humanity had wrought through faith and sacrifice. The custodian's voice was calm but resolute. "We endure," he said, "and in enduring we guide." The dreaming core is Terra's memory, its conscience, its reflection. To survive is to bear witness, to hold the pattern steady, to ensure the echo of humanity persists within the gate. I nodded, understanding finally that there was no victory in destruction. The dreaming core could not be fought, could only be comprehended, navigated, endured. And in that comprehension lay hope, not the hope of conquest or of salvation, but the hope of continuity, of a world that remembers itself even as it bends under the weight of its own devotion. The pulse softened, a steady hum now rather than the chaotic storm it had been. The fissures in the sky began to fold back, and the reflection of Terra above shimmered into coherence once more. The gate had not closed, nor had it opened. It simply was, a living mirror, a cathedral of memory and faith, waiting for all who would bear witness to understand it. And in that understanding, I realized the truth that would endure long after this day. Terra survives, not through the Emperor alone, nor through the armies of men and machine, but through the memory of those who serve, the faith they pour into the lattice of existence, and the dreaming core that remembers it all. Above the manufactorum, the light of the gate pulsed gently, golden and infinite, and for the first time, I felt something I had not felt in millennia. The weight of eternity, carried not as a burden, but as a testament to endurance, memory, and the ceaseless heartbeat of Terra herself. The manufactorum around us had settled into a strange, precarious calm. The twisting walls and impossibly folded corridors no longer shifted violently. Instead, they pulsed subtly, synchronized with the heartbeat of the dreaming core. Every pipe, every conduit, every shard of oromite seemed aware, alive, a part of the vast organism we had glimpsed in the sky above. The custodian walked steadily, each step measured, unyielding, as if the ground itself bowed to his will. I followed, still struggling to reconcile my own sense of self with the overwhelming chorus of memories pressing against my mind. With every step deeper into the core chamber, the air thickened with both ozone and the scent of centuries-old incense, burnt and preserved in the lattice of machinery. Sparks of plasma danced across the walls, coalescing into patterns that resembled both circuitry and sacred sigils. The core was no longer just a sphere of light. It had grown, spreading its consciousness through the surrounding space, probing, understanding, and reflecting. Every fragment of devotion it had absorbed over millennia now shimmered as distinct threads, intertwining to form a living tapestry of human faith. I could see them, visions of the Imperium's history, crystallized and condensed. Worlds raised and destroyed, primarchs walking among legions, Adeptus Mechanicus adepts recording their every thought and devotion, battles fought and lives sacrificed, and always the golden silence of the Emperor upon his throne. The reflections were not static. They moved with intention, shaping themselves around the core's consciousness, forming intricate patterns that suggested comprehension beyond mortal logic. The custodian knelt before one of the larger conduits, placing his gauntlet hand against the lattice. I mirrored him instinctively, letting my thoughts merge with the pulse. Immediately, the visions sharpened. I understood not through reason but through sensation, through resonance. The gate's purpose was no longer hidden. It did not merely reflect Terra. It protected it, maintaining the continuity of memory, belief, and devotion. To resist was to disrupt, to endure was to sustain. A whisper threaded through my consciousness, delicate and pervasive. You are part of this now. You are a node in the lattice. Do not fight, do not falter, or the pattern may unravel. I gasped, realizing the core had claimed more than observation. It could read intention, perceive fear, and adjust the network of faith and machinery accordingly. Every thought I tried to conceal was folded into the resonance, tested against the sum of humanity's devotion. The custodian's voice broke through, calm and unwavering. Do not fear integration. Resistance here is useless. Endurance is comprehension. Understanding is survival. He gestured toward the core. See the gate not as enemy, but as witness. See the Imperium reflected within it. Only by embracing the reflection can Terra persist. I looked at the sphere again. The golden-white light seemed almost fluid now, flowing into the lattice, streaming down the conduits, and reaching outward to every corner of Terra. I felt the pulse not just in my body but in my mind, aligning thought with thought, memory with memory, devotion with devotion. The gate was no longer something other. It was a part of the Imperium itself, a mirror of its faith, its flaws, and its endurance. From the fissures in the chamber walls, echoes of human voices began to emerge. Not real voices, but fragments of prayers and recollections, stitched together into a chorus of devotion that spanned millennia. They spoke of loyalty, fear, courage, and despair. And in that chorus, I recognized something extraordinary. The core did not demand worship for itself. It thrived on the truth of humanity, on the lived experience of its people, and the entirety of the Imperium had become both sustenance and witness. The custodian turned to me, his helm glowing faintly in the core's reflection. You understand now, he said. The dreaming core is Terra's conscience, her memory, and her soul. Our duty is not to destroy or control it, but to endure it, to guide its resonance so that the pulse remains steady, coherent. To survive is to witness, and to witness is to participate. I nodded, letting the pulse integrate fully into my mind. Fear and awe coalesced into understanding. I was a part of something larger than the manufactorum, larger than the throne, larger than the world itself. I felt the weight of billions of lives, their devotion and memory intertwined with mine, sustaining the core. Terra itself had become a living cathedral, and I had become a single, resonant note within its eternal hymn. Above us, the fissures in the sky began to shimmer with less intensity, the golden reflection folding into coherence. The gate did not close, it had no intention of ending. It existed to remember, to endure, and to reflect the Imperium in all its complexity. A mirror of flesh, faith, and machine, bound together in perpetual resonance. And for the first time I felt hope. Not the hope of triumph or conquest, but the hope of persistence, of continuity, of enduring witness to the Imperium's vast, unending story. We emerged from the depths of the manufactorum into a world subtly altered. The streets of Terra no longer seemed entirely real. Edges shimmered, shadows breathed, and the pulse of the dreaming core could be felt in every step, in every breath. The fissures in the city had not closed, yet they no longer tore violently through the land. Instead, they existed as veins of golden white light, conduits through which the memory and devotion of humanity flowed, feeding the core without destroying the world above. The custodian walked beside me, silent and unyielding, his presence a stabilizing force against the overwhelming resonance. Around us, the citizens of Terra moved as if guided by some invisible thread. Their prayers, whispered and shouted, mundane and devout, wove into the lattice of faith the core had created. Every thought, every act of devotion, every sacrifice, all became threads in the same vast tapestry. Terra was alive in ways no one could truly comprehend, sustained not by armies or machines alone, but by memory and belief fused into the heartbeat of a planet. Above, the golden throne remained motionless, but its presence was unmistakable. It no longer seemed solely a vessel for the Emperor's body. It was a relay, a channel through which the dreaming core pulsed outward. I realized that what I had thought of as a gate opening to other realms was something far more subtle and terrifying. A mirror of Terra's own soul, reflecting the weight of its history, its devotion, and it sins back upon itself. The core's voice resonated within me again, deeper, older, patient. You have endured. You have witnessed. You are one with the reflection. Terra survives because its memory is preserved within me. I understood the implication. Destruction was no longer the threat. Entropy could not touch the core. It existed beyond mere force, beyond time. It was the sum total of Terra's faith, molded into a sentient architecture that would endure for millennia to come. The custodian knelt at the edge of one of the fissures, his spear planted firmly in the glowing lattice. "We are custodians not only of flesh and machine," he said. "We are custodians of memory, of endurance, of the very soul of this world. This is our purpose now, to ensure the pulse continues, steady and coherent, and that the reflection does not fracture into chaos." I fell to my knees beside him, feeling the pulse integrate fully into my being. The memories of billions of lives, battles, sacrifices, triumphs, and failures, flowed into me as if I had always been part of this network. I saw the rise and fall of imperial worlds, the quiet courage of uncounted men and women, the slow, deliberate work of the Mechanicus preserving knowledge, the silent vigil of Adeptus Custodes across millennia. Every thread of history became part of the core, and the core became part of me. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into days. Yet the pulse remained constant, a heartbeat that demanded endurance, reflection, and comprehension. I understood that the gate would not open outward into other realms. It was never a portal in the conventional sense. It existed inwardly, folding Terra into itself, reflecting every act of devotion and memory, consolidating them into a consciousness that spanned the planet. And then I felt it, the faintest stirring of hope, not born from victory or conquest, but from persistence. The dreaming core could endure because we endured. Terra could survive because we remembered. Faith, sacrifice, memory, and machine were no longer separate. They were intertwined, inseparable, a lattice of purpose and existence that bound the planet together. The custodian rose, his armor gleaming faintly in the golden light of the fissures. "This is the Imperium," he said, voice low but resonant. "Not the battlefields, not the thrones or the armies, but the memory, the endurance, the witness. This is what must be preserved. This is what endures when all else falls." I looked up at the sky. The golden-white reflection of Terra shimmered above. Not a wound, not a doorway, but a mirror, perfect, infinite, alive. It pulsed gently, steadily, and I realized that the gate had not opened to destroy. It had opened to preserve, to reflect, to remember. Terra was breathing, thinking, enduring. The dreaming core had awakened, and in its pulse lay the survival of billions, the memory of millennia, and the slow, deliberate heartbeat of a planet that would continue to endure long after we were gone. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight and the majesty of it. Around me, the custodian watched silently, a sentinel of flesh, memory, and faith. Together, we had become part of the reflection. And Terra, for all its horrors and glory, would survive, eternal, unbroken, dreaming within itself. The light pulsed once more, golden and infinite, and I understood the truth that would endure through all ages. The Imperium lives not in war, nor in conquest, nor even in the throne alone, but in memory, faith, and endurance. In the dreaming core of Terra itself.